So next I want to show a couple of examples of variation in supply and demand, and work through what happens at the aggregate level, particularly based on the labour theory of value. As the base input-output table, I've used the labour theory from the video I made before on theory of value, theory of distribution, and the transformation problem. I want to stress again that this isn't the only way to represent the labour theory, it's only one way. There are others, so. The first example I'm going to show is what happens if some capitalists sell a product above its value. Marx generally thinks that if one commodity sells above its value, another must sell below its value. The reasoning behind this you'll recognise if you've watched the series on Sraffa. So if one commodity sells above its value there won't be effective demand for the other, and so the other will have to reduce its price. So here again, this is an input-output table, and across the rows we have the outputs of each commodity to each industry. And down the columns it's the inputs of each commodity into the production process. I represents iron, which is going to be the means of production. W represents wheat, which is the worker's means of subsistence. And the surplus product that only capitalists buy, that's going to be P, pigs. So here I've split the iron industry into two different parts. And to begin with, they're equal. So on aggregate, the iron industry's inputs are 6 units of iron and 90 units of wheat. And they're going to receive 12 pigs as their profit. So down here I've made a calculation of labour value per hour. And to calculate this I've just assumed an 8-hour working day in each sector and just multiplied 8 by the number of wheat bought by each industry, assuming one wheat represents one worker. This gives the total working hours. For example, in the wheat industry, 8 hours times 240 workers is 1,920 working hours. You then take the total of the newly added value in the day, and this is going to be the newly added value, because the value of the means of production is already set. They're just going to buy that in, and they're just part of the working day is going to just be reproducing this value again. So you take the newly added value in the day, which for the wheat industry is 12.27 and 27.73, and divide by the total working hours. So it's this plus this divided by this gives you this figure here. That's the labour value. Now what happens when we change the unit price of iron in one of these two divisions? Let's say that one set of capitalists get to the market first and they charge higher than this value here. So let's put in £1.10, the unit price they're going to charge. Well, the inputs to each iron capitalist is going to remain the same. It's going to be £5.20 and £3. But the amount of profit that this set of capitalists is going to go up because they're charging more per unit now. However, this set of capitalists is now going to be forced to sell below their value. So they're going to sell their iron at a lower unit price. So it's going to be 0.9 if they want to sell all of what they've produced. And if they don't do that, there's just not going to be enough money in society to buy all of this iron. And you can see that however much above the labour value this ends up, this set of capitalists are going to be selling below their labour value. So 0.0029 here above and 0.0029 below. Now you might say, actually this is not going to happen because the iron industry is really important and without that nothing else can be produced. So even if both of these capitalists are selling above their real value, the wheat and the pig industry are going to be forced to buy it no matter what they're charging. So let's look at what happens then. So now let's change the unit price that both capitalists are selling at to £1.10 rather than their true value of £1. So correspondingly the outputs to each industry are also going to have to rise because now the sum total is selling for £23.10 instead of £21. And I've left the original profits just at the top here so you can compare them. As you can see, because the costs of iron have risen in each sector, the wheat and the pig capitalists, they're going to see a reduction in their profits. So for instance, the rising cost of 30p here is going to mean that they're going to have 30p less to spend on their own consumption. But clearly the iron capitalists, they're also going to see a corresponding rise in their profits. And so the aggregate profit will remain the same at £23. So we can see that the original labour value per hour was 0.0208. And the workers in the wheat and the pig industry, they're now seeming to produce less value per hour. And the iron industry, they're seeming to produce more value per hour. But because the aggregate surplus hasn't changed at all, the differences between them are going to still total 0. So if you multiply this by the working hours, you're going to get this, which is going to be exactly the same as the drop in profit. So minus 30 here, minus £1.20 here, plus 75p here, and plus 75p here. And so the average, when you average all of these out, is of course going to be 0. And so the average labour is still going to be 0.0208. It's just that some commodities are now sold above and some now below their value. So in the second example, let's look at what happens when there's an oversupply, let's say in wheat. And the assumption that we're going to make is that you can use the exact same amount of labour hours and means of production. This is going to be a rare case because usually if you produce more of something, you're going to need more means of production too. But it's easy to look at, and let's just say that this year they had a better harvest, so using the same labour time, the same number of workers, and the same means of production, they're just going to have produced more. So let's say that they're now going to be producing 500 wheat. Now if they're going to try and sell this wheat at the same unit price, we're going to see that this extra wheat here is just going to go to waste. Because at the same unit price, now they're going to try and sell 52 plus £5.78 worth of wheat, that's 57.78. But they've only paid their workers £52. And since only workers are going to want to buy this wheat, there's just no way that they're going to be able to sell it at this price. So what they could do, they could try and export it. But let's just imagine that this is a closed society. And so based on this excess supply, they're going to have to lower the unit price of wheat instead to clear the market. So I'll move that back to there. And here I'll put 500. So now you can see that the unit price has dropped to 0.1040 from 0.1156. And the total price of the wheat is going to remain at 52. And that's going to be made up of £46.80, which is going to buy the 450 wheat that the workers always bought before, and £5.20, which is going to buy the surplus wheat of 50. Now in marks this is going to correspond to an extension of the surplus value, because now the workers have to work for a smaller percentage of the day to maintain their existence in wheat. So you can see here is now 0.624, and before it was 0.693. And in this case it's going to be the workers who gain that extra bit of surplus because it's their commodity that's seen a reduction in price. But as you can see, the total value that's produced is still going to be £75, the total of the newly added labour in the day. And so there's still the exact same amount of value produced per labour hour. So now let's look at example 3. Let's look this time at what's going to happen if the workers just suddenly decide that they're bored of eating wheat. They're just not going to demand as much anymore. So instead they're going to use that money to buy a small amount of pigs. Maybe you can imagine them saving up a while to buy their luxury products, but I'll just make it straightforward here and say that they're just going to spend the rest of their wage. So the demand for wheat has gone down, and the wheat industry is going to end up with an oversupply again. So let's say they're only going to demand 400 wheat. Now in the immediate short term, the wheat industry is going to waste this 50 of wheat. But now here it's also going to see a reduction in its profit. Put these up here so you can see the original profit again. So this has now gone down. And because it's only selling 46.22 worth of wheat instead of 52. And you can see here, these are the pigs that the workers are going to buy. So they're going to be buying this £5.78 worth of pigs instead of the £5.78 worth of wheat that they were buying before. But in this case, the pig industry isn't making any more profit than it ever did, and that's because of that same drop in the profit of the wheat industry. But it isn't going to make any less profit than it did before either, and that's because of this £5.78, which the workers are now spending on pigs. So this has dropped by £5.78, and this has gone up by £5.78, and so the aggregate profit is going to again remain the same. So here you can see the difference in the units of pigs that each capitalist is going to buy. So before the change they were buying 16, 32 and 12. After the change, the pig capitalist is still buying 16, the iron capitalist is still buying 12, but there's a reduction in the amount that the wheat capitalist can get, and they're only going to get 16.9 instead of 32. So now these 15.1 pigs, which used to be bought by the wheat capitalists, are going to be distributed instead to the workers like this. It's going to be 15.1. Now for the first time, the value per worker hour in the wheat industry is going to diverge from its average, and there isn't going to be a corresponding rise anywhere else. But this is going to be a short-term phenomenon. There's 4 immediate options available to the wheat capitalists to fix this issue. The first is again to try and export this wheat and just regain this lost profit. The second is just to reduce this unit price of wheat again. But since in this case the workers are just flat out bored of wheat, they just really don't want to buy any more than 400 between them, so that's not going to work in this case. The third option is to increase the unit price of wheat. So let me put in there, so they're going to sell these 400 at a higher price. And if they now increase this unit price to 0.13, they're going to be able to snatch back that money that the workers wanted to spend on pigs, because the workers are still going to need this 400 wheat to survive. So this is a contradictory theory to basic neoclassical economics, because there's an oversupply of a commodity that can be dealt with by a raise in its price rather than a fall. But it's totally possible to do this where the product is a necessary good and has to be bought. And in this case, of course, the labour value will again return to the average, because you're going to have this profit line again. The final possibility is that the wheat industry just accept that there isn't a demand for this wheat and just produce less of it. Now in this case I'm going to assume that this is going to be accompanied by a fall in the use of means of production to make the wheat to the same extent. Let me put in 400 again here. They're just going to accept that this is how things are. So here the wheat industry, they used to use 12 iron in their means of production, and in order to find out how much they're going to need to use now, we're just going to divide 12 by 450 and then times it by 400 to find the corresponding amount of iron required to make 400 wheat. And now, since the demand for iron has also dropped, there's going to be less iron required to make iron too. And we can calculate that by doing this original 6 iron and divide it by 12 plus 3, and then multiply the total by 3 plus 10.7, and it'll come out with these figures here. I've already put it in the cells. So now the iron industry is only producing 19.13 units of iron. And again there's going to be a redistribution of the surplus product based on these other changes. So since the wheat industry is going to be taking in 46.22, but its costs are also going to reduce, it's going to get a little bit more profit than what it did when that wheat was just going to waste. And since the iron industry is only taking in 19.13 now, and its costs have reduced a smaller amount, so its profits also going to be slightly lower. So now the wheat and iron industries are both producing less due to the reduced demand, but they're still employing the same number of workers. So they might decide to cut employees, but that's going to have further effects on the macroeconomy. So let's just keep it simple and say that they're just going to pay people the same wage and let them go home when they've finished. So we'll assume that if they needed 1,920 hours to make 450 wheat, they're going to need 1,920 hours divided by 450 and multiplied by 400, so 1,707 hours to make 400 wheat. And that corresponds to a 7.111 hour working day. And then, so we're again back at this 0.02083 labour value per hour. And the exact same thing happens in the iron industry. So in the theory of value and theory of distribution I did before, you could just divide this profit line by the wages and come out with an equal distribution of the profit based on the labour involved. Now this distribution, it looks on the surface very different to that, but the inclusion of this working hours variable means that it's still the labour theory. It's just harder to directly see. So it's a complexified version of the one given there, and it's a little closer to what Marx had in mind if you read the sections on absolute and relative surplus in Capital Volume 1. Anyway, I hope this helps you to see why the workings of supply and demand don't have such a big effect on the macroeconomy as they do at the micro level. Using an input-output format helps us to see the way that supply and demand at the macro level are interdependent, and how changes to prices in one sector imply changes in others. One main thing to notice here is that no matter what we did to supply and demand, the total value produced by the newly added labour in the day, that's represented by the outputs of pigs and wheat, it never changed from £75, except in the sole case where the workers decided initially to buy some pigs instead of wheat, and some wheat was wasted. So here, it dropped by £5.78. But that's clearly going to be a short-term diversion from the labour theory. And that's what Marx had in mind when he talked about the newly added labour determining values. Regardless of changes in the price of or aggregate totals of the means of production, aggregate surplus doesn't change. The surplus product just gets redistributed. The only time the aggregate surplus does change is if you try and distribute the surplus according to another rule, for instance, price of production. And again, this is a transformation problem. So under the transformation problem, this goes down, and this will also change if you're holding the value of the labour power constant. The ability of the surplus to vary according to a distribution just isn't included in Marx. For him, the only reason the absolute amount of surplus can vary is due to the length of the working day. And so this would mean that you would need to begin from calculating the average surplus from empirical data. So you can't just determine how much this is going to be from knowing the working day and the price of the necessary goods in the way that Marx thought you could. And that definitely has some implications for the labour theory. However, it doesn't change the fact that there is a distribution corresponding to the labour theory based on any matrix, and so the divergence from that distribution can also be calculated, and there might be reasons why that's useful to do.